Today, we're going to be exploring what it means to bring gentleness or compassion to leadership and the impact that it can have on an organization, on its people, and on the leader themselves. My guest today is Debbie Edwards. She is a transformational leadership coach, and she's also an energy healer as well. And one of the things that I love about working with her is that she can combine these two facets of herself really seamlessly. And so often they're phrases that don't get heard in that corporate space. And so I think she brings something really interesting to the conversation. The work that she does enables her clients to change the lens through which they see themselves. And she also supports her clients through navigating transitions, including life stages like menopause. And the language that she uses is around helping women in particular see themselves as their authentic, beautiful, powerful self. So while Debbie's work focuses on women, as with so many of my guests, I'm inviting us to explore this topic holistically and to see how her techniques can support men as well as women. And my understanding is that at the heart of her work is supporting her clients to release old patterns that have perhaps built up through social and familial conditioning. She calls it gentle leadership. For me, it also feels like compassionate leadership. And that's one of the areas that I'll be discussing with her. So, although we all know the value of compassion in our lives, we somehow often manage to ignore it or find it difficult to be compassionate when we're at work. But as the Dalai Lama says, when we're motivated by compassion and wisdom, the results of our actions benefit everyone, not just our individual selves or some immediate convenience. So, Debbie, what a joy. Hi, my darling. We've obviously just had a little chat before starting recording, and that point that we came to around how important this conversation is for so many people, actually, as we come into whatever normality is becoming, and particularly, for so many people in the UK, is like they're coming into going back to work in September or going back into the office in September. It feels even more important to be talking about this whole topic of leadership, and particularly gentle leadership, which is obviously the work that you do.
Yeah.
And the word that that for me really resonates out of it all is compassionate leadership as well. But I think there's a distinction here between that and the work you do. It feels like I'd like to sort of explore that a little bit as we go on.
Yeah.
But before we sort of dive headfirst in, it would be really lovely just to hear a little bit of your background, just so everyone listening can hear a little bit about you and get to know you.
Of course.
Cool.
Where should I start? So let's cover the career bit first, because I'm sure my own personal background will weave its way through some of our other questions. I started out really early in a teaching capacity, teaching and training. Absolutely loved it. Realized that I'm fascinated by people. And so all of my roles in those early days were very much focused on how I could create really exciting projects that just brought people to life. And that was always, when I look back on it now, that was my thing, was being able to really allow people a creative space to be themselves. Now, interestingly, I was a very gentle person, but had never really realized that. I was an extremely sensitive child. And I use that description only because that was the way I was described. When I think of the words extremely sensitive, now I know what a gift that was, because what that really meant was I was highly empathetic. I was extremely tuned in to people. And some of my spiritual gifts, I know, were very much at play. But I never, ever realized that brought a sort of gentleness and calmness to me from a very early age. When I got into my teenage years, because I hadn't realized that, and the world had told me in one way or another that gentleness was weakness, to not show the level of vulnerability that naturally bubbled up for me. I had just learned to contain that so well that I was fiercely independent. I was extremely tough on the outside, and I'd built a level of armor that allowed me then to go into industries that were extremely challenging. So I would make choices around going into some of the most difficult industries. So I started off in the military as a civilian officer. Very tough, because there was normally only one woman around the table, and that would be me. It was also a particular culture around fighting and going to war, and training and preparing to go to war. That in itself was a very interesting culture to be immersed in when you are very, very busily hiding that you're a gentle person. You can only imagine. But again, totally disassociated from that for many years. I was working for the royal ruler of Sharjah as well for a while, again in the Middle East, where women were expected to very much be in the background, and I was working as a strategic advisor for him. And again, really challenging. And I think I was choosing these environments to test my toughness, because I'd got to a stage where that message around gentleness being a weakness was so strong in my life. And actually, on one of my trips over to Sharjah, there was another male advisor to the ruler who sat me down one day and basically said, I have to tell you, you're not going to get very far in life, because you are far too kind and far too vulnerable with your gentleness in the way that you lead. And you really need to rethink how you do that. And I do remember having a moment in that meeting where I just thought, I don't think that's the truth, but I wasn't ready yet to really own that level of my own identity. And I think for many, many years, I just carried on in very challenging environments, normally male dominated, and just, for the want of a better description, battled through what was my real authenticity. It wasn't until I had children when that started to dissolve, because I couldn't go out into the world and be this really tough, hard-hitting corporate body, and then come home to my babies and be this soft, nurturing, loving, natural woman that I was. I was finding that there were more and more times when I would literally walk through the door and the tears would arrive, because it was like relief. Now I get to be myself. And my children blew that open. Becoming a mother blew that open. And I managed to juggle that for quite some time. And then I got to a point where I realized that I can't do this anymore. And that's when things started to really break down. And I've had like a 10-year journey of revealing who I am. You know, and it's been turbulent and wonderful and awful and revealing all at the same time. And I wouldn't change it for the world. But I do look back on those early years and think, you know, when I have compassion and go back to my child, and I think, God, you had it tough. You know, you had it tough.
There's so much in that story. Full stop. There's so much in that story. And thank you for sharing. And there's so much in that story that I think will resonate with so many people. And the way in which we create these strategies for how we navigate the world, and recognizing that we create these strategies right back in childhood, I think is an incredibly powerful part of that process of unraveling ourselves and finding, who we are. And I am sure that your phrase around, I think I might have been testing myself by choosing these environments, well, it definitely resonated with me. And I have a sense, as you said it, that it's going to resonate with many people listening as well, that we deliberately, subconsciously put ourselves into environments that meet the criteria that we've decided we should be living up to or reflecting in our lives, as opposed to having that courage, actually, which is not to say the other one doesn't take courage, but there's a different type of courage of being able to say, well, actually, what is it in me? What is the part of me that's really asking to be seen and heard here? And going back to something that I said in the introduction, that I know that your expertise is, really focused on working with women, but that so much of this applies with men as well. I think so often, it's one of the things I was thinking as I listened to you talk about the military, so often men feel like they've got to wear this mantle of, huge inverted commas, this mantle of manhood, and the societal concept of what that looks like. And how it feels when there's something else going on inside. It feels very tender.
Yeah, very. Yeah.
So having, you reached this point in your life where you recognized you had this gentleness and that it was valid. I'm curious about what were the things that you found that really influenced your discovery of yourself, maybe things that you hadn't expected to influence that process, either in a challenging or in a positive way.
I think motherhood was my biggest portal. That was the first portal for me to bear witness to a different way of being. So as a mother of my own children, by this point, I'd created a very different life to the one that I'd grown up in, which in many ways, as I went through it, started to reveal to me the ways in which I denied my true self, but also why I was the way I was. I'd grown up in an area which was quite a deprived area, lots of alcohol dependency, lots of drugs in the middle of the 80s when there was riots and heroin was just really taking off and hitting the streets. And I lived amongst that, and there was a lot of violence. So it's only been as I've become a mother and gone through other things later on in my life that I realized that very, very much shaped me, because I learned how to do safety well. And safety meant armoring up and being hyper vigilant every single moment of every day for potential threats that might come at me. It wasn't until later on, though, that I also realized that that's where so much of my compassion arrived as well, because I lived amongst families who I saw go down or make choices that led them down a very dark path. But I always used to see them as the human being that they were. Even as a child, I knew that they were part of loving great families, but because of where we grew up, there were so many choices that could take them down different paths. But even as a child, I knew that that didn't make them a bad person. It just meant that they were a good person who'd made bad choices.
Mm.
And I think my level of compassion started to grow then.
So it really, that whole idea of safety and self-protection really comes in here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And how that also just sort of just, you know, playing forward into the workplace then, that some of those behaviors that we can adopt in the workplace are there because it's a form of self-protection.
Totally. Yeah. It's defense mechanisms, you know, it's defense mechanism. And it's also about keeping yourself safe. But there was also an element of keeping myself small, because when I was small and hidden and invisible, then the threats wouldn't be so present. So the smaller I could make myself, the safer I felt, you know, and that really played out for so many decades in everything that I did. So I would have the armor when I needed to be defensive, and then I would have the pull towards invisibility when I felt any other kind of threat. And that impacted my work, because there was this constant friction of feeling like I wanted to really prove myself, coming from this background, this working class girl who wanted to do well, because that's what, you know, there was so many phrases back then that was like, you know, she's a working class girl, done well. And that felt like a huge badge of honor for me. And the more that came, it was the first time I'd felt real praise for choosing a path that looked very different to where I'd started. So, you know, that there was a pride element there as well that suddenly started to come into play. But also that pride then turned into me realizing that, oh, I have to keep this up now. I have to keep this up.
Your identity.
Yeah. And I was very attached to that, because underneath it, I truly didn't know what might happen if I started to break that down. And I was very afraid for many years that I would break down, dissolve, never be the same person again. And all of those things are just really, really present in you holding so tightly onto your perceived identity in the early days of my career. But what that meant was I made choices that put me in very unsafe places, because I had this misconception that I could cope. Because I'd coped from a very early child with very difficult situations. So therefore, I just used to go, it's fine, I'll do it. And I remember this one particular incident where I was about 28, 29, and I was working in the military, and a job came up, which was going back into Kosovo as a communications expert. And the role was basically you would take communications between enemy lines. So I would be on my side, and then if something had changed with regards to how the war was operating or how these two opposing sides were operating, then I would take it to the other side. It was probably the most dangerous job you could ever do. And I just ran at it like it was the best thing that I could ever do for my career. And I remember distinctly my boss at the time, who was just this really lovely, straight talking Geordie bloke. And he pulled me to one side and basically said, "What do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing? You don't get paid enough to get shot. Pull out." And that's the only time when I really thought about my own safety in some of the jobs that I was going for. And I think that was the start of, you know, when I look back now, that was the start of me thinking, why do I keep doing this? You know, why do I keep putting myself in situations where I know I'm not happy when I get there? But again, it's like this proving myself. The more dangerous, the more difficulty that I can cope with, then people will go, well, that's just Debbie. She can cope with anything. But then that coping mechanism became so deeply entrenched that then I had nowhere to go, because I couldn't ask for help. And I couldn't say, actually, I don't think I can cope, because that had gone. Because I wouldn't allow myself then, because I built up this impression of me that she's the one who goes into war zones. And then I suddenly thought, well, how can I be vulnerable on the other side?
How can I become the person who doesn't go into war zones? How can I become the person who's gentle,
you know.
And there's something there about that story, Debbie, where the word that came up for me was alive.
Mm-hmm.
That by putting yourself into those really challenging and dangerous situations, that there's a sense of aliveness to it as well, a sense of visibility.
Yeah.
And so I wonder whether that's that, you know, part of the challenge, I think, of having kind of high sensitivity, just as you said, is about the vulnerability of being seen, and so keeping yourself small. And to counteract that, the only way to be seen was to be in these volatile situations.
Yeah.
I think there's something else, a connected thought there as well, is that you described yourself as a sensitive child, and so often, you know, that's that language that people assign to children, you know, about, oh, she's a sensitive little thing, or whatever it might be. And actually now the evidence and the research around HSP and highly sensitive people, and I will share a link actually to the HSP questionnaire that people can do, because I think that's such an important and clear step toward identifying, well, hang on a minute, this thing that I've been feeling all my life, well, maybe it's not because I'm weak, or I you know, haven't got a tough enough skin, or I take things too personally, which are all of these
all of those messages.
All of those messages. Actually, it can be because you are highly sensitive, and I would imagine you score incredibly highly on the scale, and it's a neurological, you know, it's evidenced. It's
completely. And if you can imagine being a highly sensitive person in that kind of environment, what you're picking up on continually is tough, you know, because your level of empathy for what is going on around you is overwhelming for a child. But also in those days, the messaging around being sensitive or being more prone to knowing your emotions and allowing them to come through, you know, the only thing that was really celebrated in those days was toughness. Be tough, you know, get on with it, just get over it and get over yourself. And
oh, well, Thatcher, shoulder pads,
all of it, and then do it all as well. Have 10 kids and then run a hedge fund. And so when you have reached this age of 51, you've gone through decades of very, very strong messaging that says toughness is celebrated, getting through, getting over is celebrated. None of that gentleness and sensitivity is celebrated. And I think, you know, for women, that was very true. But when you do look at it and apply it to men, they've always had that. They've always had that and still have that. And we're not, there's no equity when it comes to true authenticity. You know, I do smile when I work with companies who say, we've told everybody, bring your authentic selves to work. And I've had to put my hands on the table and go, really? Are you ready for that? you ready for that box opening? Because quite frankly, I don't think there's many companies out there who are ready for that true authenticity to come through, because they have no idea the messaging that's gone on for every single unique human being in their organization. And very, very much around leadership, that level of be tough because it's celebrated. If you're seen as the one who can cope and get through and never gives up and is always there, you can always count on them. But at what cost? At what cost to them? And I think it's really tough for men. And we are starting to see a massive shift. And especially from some of the mums that I talk to who have sons, their concerns are, he doesn't really get to express himself. You know, he doesn't. And I cannot, having been a woman who's done that because of very difficult circumstances in her childhood, I know how lonely that is. And that loneliness can be so isolating as well. Because unless you're given a safe space to express who you truly are, then you can become very invisible and very angry about that and very disassociated from who you are truly. And it can lead to some serious mental health issues, you know, which we're seeing, and I have real concerns around that. So yeah, the element of leadership that I sort of talk about is what I call true modern leadership, where some of these natural traits that both sexes experience and have and harbor deep within them are given space safely, psychologically safely, to emerge. And for each unique human being to then say, that's my super strength. How do I harness that for me and for the work that I want to do in this world, you know?
It's really interesting. I've just had that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, go through my head. And I have to confess, I don't think I ever actually read it when it came.
I didn't, but my husband did, and he was blown away.
I think I might have read a précis of it. Yeah. And I think that there is an awful lot of weight given to gender distinctions. But actually, I loved your phrasing there when you said about what is my unique strength. What is it, or what is it about me that makes me uniquely myself?
Yeah.
And this, because for me, that implies a smoothing out of the distinctions between genders, and the distinctions between cultures, and the distinctions between, you know, societal, history. Because actually, when that stuff can get smoothed out and you can get a real sense of who you are, that's actually how you become your authentic self.
Yeah.
Because so often for all of us, we're all carrying these stories that from our families, from society, from culture, you know, from our upbringing, whatever, that are influencing how we show up in the world. And I think you're so right that for men, particularly now, it feels even more important that the gender conversation just dissolves, because there is an equal amount of compassion and love and humanity in all of us. It's just that the way that we've been conditioned to express it has been very different. And as men, more and more men, you know, tap into that ability of being able to be vulnerable, to be their authentic self, to use that word. I think it becomes even more important that we create the space where everyone can show up in that way. When I think through my own corporate career,
Mm.
And some of the behaviors that I witnessed,
Yeah.
and I know that in their heart, there's one character in particular, and I used to think of him as a little boy,
Mm. Yeah.
a toddler
Yeah.
who just had never learned how to emotionally regulate himself.
No.
And it broke my heart.
Yeah.
It also frightened me,
Yeah.
and it made me angry, and
Yeah.
it frustrated me,
Yeah.
and all of those other things. But when I was like able to come into myself, it broke my heart because I just saw a very unhappy man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And the awful thing around that, I'm just going to put my headphones on because some of my family members have come back in the room. Let me just fix that. Yeah, the awful thing about that is that then any chance of true connection is just gone. Any chance of true connection from human to human. There's so many barriers up when that comes into play because everybody's just in protection mode. It's like, this is my bit. Let me protect this. Whether you tell me you're not a threat or not, I don't necessarily feel that because something feels dysregulated here and I don't know how to soothe myself. So therefore my responses are going to be what I've relied on, and I'm just going to hit at it and hit at it and hit at it because that's the only way I know to stay safe. And also, please don't come at me with any woo-woo talk about how we could break that down because I don't know who I'd be after that.
Beautiful.
I don't know who I'd be after that. And I don't know whether I can hold or be held in order to take myself to that place and know that it will be okay.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, Debbie. I have three quotes that I want to share.
Mm-hmm.
They are all from academic studies of compassion in the workplace. So one is from Frost et al. In 2000. So this is not a new thing either. Where they found experiencing compassion at work connects co-workers psychologically and results in a stronger bond between them. So that feeling of safety.
Yeah.
From Lilius et al. In 2008, those who experience compassionate leadership at work are more likely to report effective commitment to their organization and to talk about it in positive terms. So it also builds trust. Mm-hmm. And then from Eisenberger in 2006, supervisors who perceive that their organization values their well-being are more likely to show supportive behavior towards the people they manage. Mm-hmm. So it creates this virtuous circle. Mm-hmm. And I think, amidst all of that, if the core feeling inside us is, I don't know who I would be if I don't have these protective layers, then none of that stuff that they've talked about can happen.
No.
Because in order to change, there has to be a willingness to change.
Yeah.
And we have to trust our environment enough to know that it will support us as we go through that.
Yeah.
So how can we identify where we've been adopting these maladaptive behaviors that mask our natural gentle qualities? What are some of the things that we can, people working in leadership roles or leading ourselves, leading our families, leading our communities, whatever it might be, how can we identify what might be masking our true nature?
I think one of the things that really strikes me is that we need to have more conversations on this deep level about what true leadership means moving forward in this new world. For me, we have to go back to each individual. We have to start thinking of a fingerprint approach. The
because there's so much uniqueness that exists within our organizations. And quite often what we try to do is fix a solution by bringing collectives together. And I don't always think that works, because by a certain stage in your career, and I can testify to this, you've become very good at hiding, saying the right things, presenting the right behaviors, doing the very corporate-led way of showing up. And then you do what I do, you go home and cry. Yeah, every day for weeks, you know? So there's an element of bringing it in some ways away from the collective, with a knowledge that there's a space available for you to come back in. And the collective is a thing that supports you in your self-leadership journey. That's what I'd really like to see. Because as you rightly pointed out, leadership is not just about the job that you do. It's about the way that you move throughout your entire life. And it is the way that you parent. It is the way that you make choices. It is the way that you communicate with your partner. All of these things make up the leader that you are. And so bringing it right back to self-leadership for me is where we start to think about a much more modern approach to leadership. Because when you teach that individual to lead with things that aren't spoken about, so let me show you why it's important for you to have compassion for yourself. Let me show you why it's important that you are kind to yourself. Let me show you why every day, if you lead with love, you can only then go on and have positive interactions, even if they're difficult and dark. You know, you stop being afraid of the challenging situations, because everything within inside you, it comes from an anchor point that is about deep-rooted self-love and self-compassion. And we're not doing that. We're trying to do this collective piece, and we follow trends, and we do things like, oh, this links to our diversity and inclusion policy. And it sounds great and it feels great. But until you actually get that individual to feel as though they have total agency over who they are and how they show up in your world and their world, we're not truly going to get there. The reason we exist like this is because, let's think about it. One of the key things that we don't talk about is self-soothing. And I really think that's a critical part. We think that having an ability to soothe ourselves in different circumstances is left behind when we're 3, 4, and 5. It's very acceptable to say, oh my God, I feel overwhelmed. I think my emotions are rising up. And then somebody will jump in and say, hey, here's a soother. Here's a blankie. Go and have a nap. Have you eaten? You know, what do you need from me? But then school starts and we go, okay, would you like to be really independent now? And that's it. So there's no discussion around, as adults, as young adults, where we need the most self-soothing techniques, or as we go into very challenging environments like the work environment. Through all of that, even when I became a parent, I needed to know how to soothe myself so that I could understand how to soothe my child.
And there is something here around the strategies that we do learn to soothe ourselves become alcohol, food, and more work. You know, the great irony around, you know, stressed people is that often they're using work as a form of soothing themselves because it's known it's the only way to create control. She says, from personal experience. And so there's also something there as well. Just listening to I had a little moment of like, oh, you know, when a baby, you know, or a toddler, their emotions rise, and we turn to them and give them a blankie or a you know, whatever it might be. It's also about educating and supporting that small child into how to identify what it is that they most need without us just imposing it upon them.
Absolutely. You're teaching people You're teaching people over a period of time to tend to their needs, and we don't. And we don't.
And to do that in the most compassionate, present way, not in a leave them to cry and they'll work it out, because that equally just leads to isolation and fear and loneliness. And there's lots of work by Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk about that, you know, the importance of attentive parenting. But that's really, really interesting, Debbie, that how we soothe ourselves so that as we come up into a kind of classic workplace high stress situation, or familial, you know, maybe like everybody's shouting in the house around us, or at work and deadlines have loomed. If we're not able to identify, hang on a minute, this is making me feel unsafe. And so what do I need right now as first aid before I can respond clearly, compassionately, consciously to this situation? If we can't do that, we go into that triggered amygdala hijack response of I'm unsafe, I'm going to run, I'm going to fight, or I'm going to hide. Really, yes, I love that. So how do you teach leaders, men and women, how do you teach them around that self-soothing sort of process, you know, the kind of beginning, middle and end of that?
I mean, for some it takes, you know, 6 months of working to break down some of the very entrenched, deep-rooted patterns that have got them to the stage where they've been seeking me out. For others, it can happen in one session. You know, it can be transformational. And so I think that I've noticed with my work that there's one question that I can use with people where I say, right, we're just about to go into what I call the gentle observation stage. And this is where I call it gentle observation, but the underlying components of that are I'm giving them permission to just look and watch. I'm giving them permission to not judge. I'm giving them permission to be patient with themselves just for a day. And I'm giving them permission to report back without any need to give an opinion. Just report back. What do you notice? And that means they start to be present in their own lives, which a lot of people on the busy corporate wheel just aren't. And throughout that day, I say to them, go through your normal day as your gentle observer. When you come up with your normal challenges and anything that would normally just raise up and create a trigger for a pattern, I want you to take a pause and you're going to ask yourself one question, which is, how can I love myself even more deeply right now? And that's it. Use that one question. I cannot tell you the breakthroughs that come from that in really simple ways, but that still bring people to tears, because it will be things like, I came in from work, I had had a really awful day. My first thought was, but you've also got to do that other thing tonight. And then I remembered, how can I love myself even more deeply right now? I ran myself a bath and I had the deepest sleep I've ever had in months. And then they wake up, and what's happened is their nervous system is calmer. They've already placed a new muscle in their neural pathways, because I haven't just asked them to lead from love. I've said, tell your body what it needs to show you how you can love yourself even more right now. In that sentence, you're already telling your body, I love you already. But what more can I do for you? And they go, oh, that's new. Because now the foundation is, I love myself. The expansion is, how could I love myself more?
That's very powerful. It's very, very powerful. So I am very familiar with asking myself, and will also use sort of this in retreats as well, and coaching around what's the kindest thing I can do. But I love the distinction there with the base layer of how can I love myself even more. Beautiful, Debbie. That's landed in a little part of my brain. So what here we are. We recognize that we're working in a way which is incongruent with ourselves. It doesn't necessarily mean that the place we're working isn't right, or that the job that we're doing isn't right, but just that the way that we're showing up feels in some way out of kilter with who we are. Quite often, I think that what we do is we blame the job, or we blame the organization, or we blame the industry, which that's definitely what I have done myself, and I've seen across many, many clients as well. But actually, the challenge is that somewhere our kind of value set or our sense of self is being compromised in some way. We make a conscious choice to start to shift. We start to ask ourselves that question of how can I love myself even more right now? What are some of the things that can get in the way of that? What are some of the things that can be useful for people just to be gently, compassionately aware of that may get in their way?
I think there's resistance to love playing a part. Amazingly, because let's be honest, that's all any of us really want, you know.
I nodded a lot, but if you're listening rather than watching on YouTube, I think the resistance to loving ourselves is
the resistance to love or playing a part in your work as well, and love for yourself. That's never talked about. Never ever is love raised as a portal or a gateway for doing amazing creative work, but also doing it in a way that honors your needs at the same time. And I wrote a piece about it on LinkedIn not long ago because it felt extremely relevant right now with the loss that we've gone through and the challenges that we've gone through. And my question was, you know, with modern leadership, are we ready to talk about love yet? Because I think we need to be. You know, if when I imagine a nirvana type world where everybody comes into work and every single thing that they think of is done out of love for themselves, can you imagine that kind of workplace? I mean, for a moment, just imagine that. There would be so much compassion. There would be so much patience. There'd be so much acceptance. There'd be so much willingness to see each other, because truthfully, that's all anybody I work with, what they really want is the most basic things in life is they want to be seen and they want to be heard. And that's where the friction is in work, is that if you're in meetings and you feel like nobody's listening to your opinion, if other people are getting promoted and you're not, like you say, you can blame the workplace, but what's really going on? You know, what's really going on? So it's that, you know, that resistance to having some of these deeper conversations, because, you know, I'll be honest, you know, the biggest portal for me was grief. You know, losing my dad 4 years ago sent me into a journey of discovery that I didn't ask for. I wasn't planning on. And I honestly had no idea how deep it would take me in good and bad ways. But that was a catalyst for me for starting to think about the fact that we have to bring love into the workplace, because I distinctly remember sort of 2 months in, just not feeling able to even get out of bed. I was running a tech startup at the time. And I remember thinking, I know this is tough right now, but how the hell does anybody who's gone through this, any sort of loss, no matter what it is, with the work conditions that we currently have, people are expected to go through. So what I went through, sort of 8 weeks of caring for my dad after a prognosis that was very shocking, then caring for him as he died. And then 2 weeks later, I'm expected to turn up for work and behave like nothing's happened. And is, you know, that's a very general approach to describe it, but there isn't the capacity or the room for us to be bringing our humanness and the things that happen to us as part of our humanity into the workplace. So that means that becomes another thing that you cover up and that you armor over, and that you say, okay, well, I'll keep that. I describe it as I put my backpack at the door, I'll leave it there with security, go in for 8 to 10 hours, and I'll absorb all of the things there, layer it on top of my grief, and then I'll go back and I'll attach the grief back in the bag, put it on, heavy load, go home. You know, and I truly don't think that, especially with what we've been through, that we have the capacity anymore to continue working in that way. And that's why you're seeing so many people, and especially the younger generation, who look at that leadership paradigm and that work paradigm and reject it outright, because they instinctively are watching it and know that's not going to bring out the best in me. That doesn't look like a life I want to create. So companies are going to have to get much more creative, because I describe this, you know, we spend billions of pounds in the last 15 to 20 years looking at things like the Internet of Things. And my question is, where are the billions of pounds that need to be invested in the humanity of things? Because ultimately, that's where the investment is required, because we can't keep just having this responsiveness where another tech platform will be built so that you can handle the mental health of your employees. Great. We all celebrate the fact that goes on to be a unicorn, but we don't think of why it's needed in the first place.
It's getting back to the root.
Yeah, what's the root cause? What's the root cause? And the pandemic has given us a lot to learn from, because people have been forced to work in a different way. And it's illuminated where there's still a lack of equity, still a lack of equality, and a lack of humanity in the way that we build our work practices.
It's really interesting as well. You talk about how sort of new generations come up into, you know, the workforce and become leaders of the future and entrepreneurs and creators, and how if you look back over the last kind of 50 years, so often those young people end up adopting the same behaviors. You know, we ended up adopting the same behaviors of our forebears because we didn't know that there was another way. It's like, well, this is how you do it. Anton, quite often, he used to do copywriting training going into organizations. And one of the things he talked about was formalitis. So it was like people would arrive at the door, they'd walk in, and suddenly their language would change and they become incredibly formal. And you see that, like, you know, corporate documents, which is now starting to shift. But it was almost like, well, that's the only way that you can communicate when you're at work.
Yeah.
And it takes something to like dislodge us, to make us realize, well, hang on, there is another way. And so to your point around the pandemic, that has dislodged so much, you know, obviously in tragic ways, but also in ways that, I mean, I know one of my old employers, you know, they've now written home working into contracts as a right. Yeah. And, you know, if it's right for you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, I think that's a really amazing thing for them to have done. And so being able to see that there is another way, I think that's the really big lesson that I'm taking from this conversation, actually, that there is another way. We don't have to do things just because that's what we saw or what we've experienced or what we've done until now. There is a choice here around how we can show up. And from my personal experience, it's really interesting when you do start to make the shift, because other people tend to say, oh, it's so nice. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that shocked me more than anything, I think, about my own transformation, which I think it has been, is where I was so worried about what people would think about me showing up as myself. And, you know, is that for them, it was like, oh, God, it was so bloody obvious.
Oh, my God. All the time.
Of course, that's what you are like. Of course, that they're the, you know, the things that you love to do. Of course, this is how you are.
Yeah.
Because they could see it far more clearly than I could. And actually, in the loop, the conversational loop that so often happens with these podcasts, we're back to the beginning of your story with the guy saying to you, if you don't toughen up, because even though you'd been through that experience in the military, you were working, you know, out in the Middle East, you thought you had this protective layer. You thought you were showing up as tough.
Yeah.
But he could see your gentle self.
Yeah.
Now, the advice he gave you was suspect.
Yeah.
But he was only responding in the way that he knew how to respond because of his own upbringing. But he could see you. He saw your gentleness. And so there's something here about actually the shift doesn't need to be as dramatic as we fear it is.
No.
There's a settling in here rather than a grand reveal.
Yeah. And a lot of unlearning. I describe, you know, the last 4 years has not been about learning. It's been about unlearning and leaving behind. And I think that's why I do so much work around leaving old patterns behind, because I didn't know where to start. So grief was, you know, a bit of a catastrophic portal for me, but the best one I could have ever had for me. And I do look back on it now and think it was a huge gift given to me by my dad to truly give me the time to reveal myself and feel able to do that. You know, I do see it as a gift. But I realized that in that period, I've also had coaches. You know, you and I have worked together. I've had therapists, you know, because what was really needed was sometimes a mirror, sometimes just a space that felt really safe to say something out loud that maybe you wouldn't want to say to a family member, because sometimes, you know, some of the things I would maybe admit to, I'd say to my husband, he'd go, really? That's how you feel? Because that, you know, to our closest and nearest and dearest, they just take you as Deb, you know, that's just Deb being Deb. And, you know, but even some of the deepest things that you're feeling or worried about, you're still not saying them. And that's where you need to get to. And I only know that now because I've been through that. So my work is very much around that. And it's a beautiful piece of work, but it's tough, because this is what humaning well, or adulting, this is what it looks like, you know. And lots of my work, when I say to people, you do know that there's joy to be found in the dark as well as in the light, and there's love to be found there too, you know, that soft acceptance that most of what we go through and most of who we are is messy and inconvenient and not perfect and can throw stuff at you that you're really not prepared for. That acceptance of that messiness is so freeing, because then you have nothing that you need to armor up against. No, there's no need for plans. There's no need for drawing up, you know, your battle plans. There's nothing that can challenge you, because you accept that it's part of who you are. I am light and the dark. I am. But my dark does not make me unlovable. My dark does not allow me, restrict my feelings of joy at all. So that level of acceptance is where I see the freedom, and I think that's it. The basics and core of my work is that I free people.
Oh. Wow, gosh, what a lovely place to bring our conversation to a close. And I think there's something really powerful in there as well about your sharing of the people that you have worked with to support you. And I'm really honoured to have been one of those people, which is how we know each other, of course. And through the work, connected by the wonderful Powder, Rebecca. But also just the importance of having that safe space. So if, as people are listening, just recognizing, I know, for me, the people who have supported me on my journey, as they've been there to hold the space in which I could push up against the parameters of my being, without judgment, without fear of criticism, just being held, being allowed to say ridiculous things, and being able to say powerful things, and being able to cry, and being able to be angry and defensive, and all of that stuff that comes with change, and to be able to do it knowing that you're held, and it is, it's that's why I do think that somehow in this particular moment the real transformation will come if we don't go straight into override and this language that is already being used of build back better. It's creating an urgency culture that isn't required right now. What is needed is what you've just described: space, time, patience, acceptance of the myriad of emotions that will come up now and might not, for some, surface until another year. That there's so much that can be said about space, and somebody described it when I was talking about how I felt about my dad not being around, and she said, it's the presence of absence. And I was like, oh my God, it's the presence of absence. But sometimes actually the presence of absence of somebody needing anything from you, a deadline to be met, something you're supposed to be, somewhere you're supposed to be. Presence of absence is the thing that creates the moment for some people to transform. Wonderful. Debbie, there's a question that I always ask my guests, and I believe you may well have answered this question before, because it's also something I ask my coaching clients as well. If you see this time in your life as a chapter in your book of life, what would the chapter heading be?
Love. That's it.
And on that, ladies and gentlemen listening, we're going to go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie. So yet another illuminating conversation with an amazing guest. I so hope you enjoyed listening to Debbie and hearing her life story as much as anything. What a fascinating journey she's been on, and her own honesty about the experiences that she's had and how they have then shaped the changes and the transition that she's taken herself on as she's allowed herself to be fully present in her full gentleness. One of my reflections, I mentioned this on the actual recording on the podcast, was that so often when we sense that something needs to change, we look outside of ourselves. We look at where we live, we look at where we work, we look at who we work with or the industry we work with, or we look at our friendship group, or we look at our community, and we say something about that is wrong for me. Now, that may well be the case. It may be that there are some changes that need to be made in your external life too. However, the real work, or the sort of deeper work, is exploring what is it about ourselves that could do with some attention here. And one of the things that I'm really grateful for, I didn't know it was going to happen at the time, but I'm grateful with hindsight, is that the shift for me from my own crucible moment of grief, of my loss of my mother, and then my health failing me, was that I actually stayed in that corporate world for another 2 more years. And I actually did my transition into revealing myself while I was there. And I'm really grateful to that organization actually for, unknowingly giving me the space to do that. So I think it's just that I've talked about this on the podcast before about, are we running from, or are we running toward something? Just being really mindful of what's our internal experience, and are we clear about what's actually feeling sort of out of kilter for us? Is it something that's external in our environment right now, or is it something about the way that we are responding to our environment because something within us is feeling compromised in some way? To connect with Debbie, take a look at the show notes, and as ever, I thank you for listening. I've realised this has been quite a long episode, actually, over an hour, I think. So thank you for being with us for this time. Thank you to Angus. I know you told me to stop thanking him, but I can't. And thank you for all of your wonderful feedback. And please do share your comments and feedback on Apple Podcasts. It really is so useful to help others see the kind of work that we do here. And I send you a hug and a wave.